Thank you all for joining the League of Women Voters of Lower Cape Fear's Hot Topics today. We are, the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization, neither supporting nor opposing candidates or political parties. We do, however, support political positions upon occasion. The League of Women Voters is an organization fully committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion in principle and in practice. And to learn more about us, you can go to the website as noted. We also recognize the tribal lands of the Waccamaw, Siouan, and Indigenous people of the Lower Cape Fear. Today, we are going to be hearing from Emily Donovan. But before she does, we hear from her, I'd like to thank Sharon Valentine and Beth Hansen for setting up this meeting. It's a lot of work. There are a lot of people that go into something like this, and we appreciate their work. I ask you all to mute yourselves so that we can get a clear signal from Emily, and place your questions in the chat. We have people who will be scanning that, and at the end of her presentation, we'll have her answer some of those questions. Thank you. Emily is one of the rising, or she's not a rising star, she is one of the stars in the environmental protection arena in our area of the world. She is co-founder of Clean Cape Fear, which, as you may be aware, is a grassroots community group which formed about the time or right after we learned that Chemours was polluting our drinking water. Her work has helped North Carolina's PFAS problem become not only a local problem, but a local, state, federal problem. And she's been very active in all of those arenas. She's testified before Congress a couple times. She's been on Washington Post Live. She helped organize the dark waters screenings that we had here in town. If you didn't get to see that, find it somewhere and take a look at it. It's very interesting, I guess is the proper word. She has been very active in local groups, and just recently has provided or seen to it that 49 schools in Brunswick County and New Hanover County have reverse osmosis filling stations for the kids. That's really important that our children get clean water. She's a member of the leadership team for the National PFAS Contamination Coalition and sits on numerous community advisory boards working to address PFAS. So we thank Emily for being here. She has a busy schedule. She's taken time to work with us today. Thank you so much, Emily. You're on.
Well, good morning. I'm really happy to be here, and it's an honor. I'm going to take a second to just share my screen real quick. Oops, sorry, you guys, for the hiccups. It worked. Oh, here we go. All righty, are we good?
Yep.
Wonderful. Well, it is an honor to be here today, and I'm going to talk about our region's PFAS contamination crisis and some of the work that Clean Cape Fear is doing to bring much needed health studies to our region. PFAS stand for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or as I like to call them, permanently freakish altering stuff. Permanent because they do not biodegrade and there's currently no proven safe disposal method. This is why they're often called forever chemicals. Freakish because the carbon-fluorine bond does not naturally occur, it must be forced. Altering because the health effects associated with these compounds appear to be endocrine disrupting and alter us at a cellular level. Stuff because the chemical industry has been using PFAS for decades to enhance the performance of food packaging, cell phones, long-lasting mascara, stain-resistant textile products. They're even used in water filtration and fuel cell storage. Clean Cape Fear is a grassroots organization, meaning that we are not a nonprofit or paid advocates. We are residents living in an active contamination zone. We formed 5 years ago with a primary focus to build public awareness and seek accountability around PFAS uses and contamination. We are still learning the full scope of Chemours' PFAS contamination crisis, but here's a brief overview of what we know so far. There are over 500,000 residents in Wilmington, Brunswick County, and parts of Pender who rely on the Cape Fear River as their primary source of drinking water. These residents pull their source water from an intake pipe directly downstream from Chemours' Fayetteville Works site. In 2017, we publicly learned about PFAS contamination when a local reporter accidentally discovered a research paper published 6 months prior documenting large quantities of a chemical called Gen X in Wilmington's tap water. Based on this study, it's reasonable to assume we were consuming on average 631 parts per trillion of Gen X for decades. Chemours publicly disclosed 5 years ago their facility was releasing Gen X into our drinking water supply since 1980. It's also important to note Dr. Canapé's lab detected PFOA and PFOS exceeding the EPA's lifetime health advisory limit of 70 parts per trillion and 45% of the samples taken. PFOA and PFOS were voluntarily phased out of production in 2012. Dr. Canapé's samples were taken 2 years later. Some research suggests PFAS air emissions from Chemours could possibly transfer into PFOA and PFOS once they leave the facility. We now know Gen X was likely only 12% of the total PFAS found in our tap water during the height of our PFAS exposures. It's reasonable to assume we were drinking approximately 130,000 parts per trillion of total PFAS based on retroanalysis by Dr. Canapé's lab of the samples taken in 2014. For Fayetteville residents, there are over 6,000 homeowners and counting struggling with private well contamination from PFAS air releases due to decades of irresponsible manufacturing practices from DuPont and later Chemours. We still don't know how many private wells are impacted because Chemours has not finished their court-ordered sampling program. The latest news reports show the contamination extends at least 25 miles from Chemours and tends to follow historic wind pattern data. Every dot on that map represents a human life. North Carolina's Department of Environmental Quality recently ordered Chemours to expand its private well sampling program near the Fayetteville Works site to include private well owners in Brunswick, Columbus, New Hanover, and Pender counties. This is due to detection of Chemours PFAS and monitoring wells as far away as Calabash and Topsail Beach. Approximately 11,000 private well owners recently received letters in the mail encouraging them to contact Chemours for free third-party well testing. As we continue to unlock the mysteries surrounding the extent of DuPont and Chemours' PFAS contamination in our region, quick action from scientists at NC State were able to document levels of PFAS exposures in our blood in 2017. Wilmington residents who participated in the Gen X exposure study had 10 different PFAS in their blood. Wilmington participants also showed elevated levels of PFOA and PFOS in their blood that was often 2 to 3 times higher than the national average. The median blood levels for Wilmington participants were 25.3 nanogram per liters. This is significant because some research suggests PFAS blood levels as low as 2 to 4 nanogram per liters may be linked to kidney disease and high cholesterol, which is known to increase the risk of heart disease, heart attacks, and/or strokes. In 2019, the Gen X exposure study expanded to include Fayetteville area residents. Preliminary data showed 22 PFAS detected in at least one blood sample taken. Participants also had high levels of PFOA and PFOS in their blood, well above the national average, just like Wilmington residents. While the Gen X exposure study is valuable information for our communities, it cannot and should not be the only health study in our region. In order for scientific and medical communities to provide us with links to causal harm, we need large-scale epidemiological and human health studies that contain tens of thousands of participants in our region, not hundreds or 1,000. The Gen X exposure study is not designed to look for cancers or other endpoints of growing concern in our region. Currently, the study is looking at impacts to thyroid and cholesterol. It is well documented we were overexposed to PFAS for decades, the majority of which came from Chemours. It's in our water, our air, and our blood. PFAS are linked to some serious health effects like cancer, hormone disruption, liver and kidney disease, developmental and reproductive harm, and immunotoxicity, often at low doses. We know the EPA estimates there are between 6,000 and 9,000 different PFAS in use. Unfortunately, except for the most well-studied PFAS, namely PFOA and PFOS, there is very little health effects data on nearly all PFAS the EPA estimates currently in use. This leaves communities like ours at a huge disadvantage. It hinders our ability to have meaningful conversations with our doctors about preventative care or altering lifestyle choices, which could counterbalance any unknown exposure risks. For example, if exposures to PFAS causes liver damage, could our doctors be recommending dietary and lifestyle changes as a precaution? We don't know. Or screening us earlier as a part of preventive care. Again, we don't know this right now. What I do know, though, is we deserve access to this information. One way to gain access to this important health data is through the EPA's Toxic Substance Control Act. TSCA is EPA's primary chemicals management law. Under TSCA, the EPA approves new chemicals and/or new uses for existing chemicals. It's also responsible for determining if a chemical is safe enough for commercial use or release into the environment. In 2016, TSCA was amended due to growing bipartisan concern and frustration surrounding its effectiveness. The amendment makes it a mandatory requirement for the EPA to evaluate existing chemicals with clear and enforceable deadlines, provide risk-based chemical assessments, increase public transparency for chemical information, and ensure the EPA is adequately funded to meet these new requirements. The most significant change to TSCA was the removal of the grandfather clause. When TSCA was enacted in 1976, it grandfathered thousands of existing chemicals without any evaluations or risk assessments. Thanks to the bipartisan amendment in 2016, the EPA now has full authority to review and assess chemicals like the PFAS coming from Chemours' Fayetteville Works facility, and require Chemours to pay for this testing, especially when there is such well-documented evidence of widespread and chronic exposures. Now, TSCA has two sections which provide us with access to the health studies we deserve and legal mechanisms to ensure the EPA complies if we're able to prove our requests are valid. Section 4 of TSCA gives EPA legal authority to issue test orders to chemical companies so long as the EPA can verify the chemical or chemicals of concern may present an unreasonable risk, and there's currently insufficient data to determine environmental and health effects. Section 4 also gives the EPA broad authority to issue a wide range of testing orders, such as human epidemiological studies, mixture studies, cancer studies, and animal testing, which has become controversial in recent years. Section 21 allows residents to petition the EPA and request these testing orders. It also outlines the legal path forward to challenge petition denials within a district court. In addition, TSCA also provides special protection for vulnerable populations like ours. Now, why are we pursuing TSCA versus relying on the work of independent or academic labs? For starters, academic labs and federal or state agencies simply cannot supply all the answers, nor should they. We believe chemical companies like Chemours should be required to pay for comprehensive health effects testing before releasing their chemicals into our world. Sadly, this has not happened, but amended TSCA gives communities like ours a path forward and a glimmer of hope. A responsible chemical company should have nothing to hide and be willing to fund these important studies, especially if they're desperately wanting to be seen as a good neighbor. Historically, the EPA has a very poor record of requiring industry testing under TSCA, and companies like DuPont and Chemours have benefited financially from this for 40 years. This is why the petition process within TSCA's Section 21 is an important legal mechanism for harmed communities. So in May of 2019, I began working with the Center for Environmental Health drafting our TSCA petition. We officially filed the petition in October of 2020, along with Cape Fear Riverwatch, Democracy Green, North Carolina Black Alliance, and Toxic Free NC. I believe we deserve to know the health risks associated with our PFAS exposures coming from Chemours. We deserve a fighting chance to protect our health and the health of our children. Our doctors and medical professionals deserve access to health effects data that better informs the care we receive. And we cannot access the best possible protective or preventative care if our doctors don't know the disease risks associated with our unique PFAS exposures. Our TSCA petition asked the EPA to require Chemours pay for a comprehensive testing plan on 54 PFAS we documented were released from Chemours' Fayetteville Works site. The petition does not cover legacy PFAS like PFOA and PFOS no longer produced by Chemours. Our testing plan was developed and advised by some of the nation's leading PFAS toxicological experts. The 54 PFAS we selected at the time had strong exposure evidence in our air, soil, water, food supply, and/or human blood. We also requested an independent science panel oversee the testing. We carefully documented where the 54 PFAS we selected for our petition had insufficient health data available and presented an unreasonable risk to our health due to their similarities to legacy PFAS like PFOA and PFOS, which are known to be harmful. Our petition requested important animal studies on major health effects, mixture studies that represent our real-world exposures, and a large-scale human epidemiological study similar to the C8 science panel done on PFOA in West Virginia. We also requested fate and transport studies to better understand the true extent of our exposures, as well as ecological effects testing to gain insight into how our PFAS exposures are impacting the ecosystem we rely on to sustain us in this region. So that crazy chart is a literature review of the 54 PFAS in our petition. The blue squares show where test data was sufficient. Yellow squares show incomplete health data, and red shows no health data publicly accessible for our review. The green squares represent where we did not request human epidemiological testing for those specific PFAS. We filed our petition in October of 2020. It was rejected by the Trump EPA that following January. When Biden took office, we decided to resubmit our petition under the new administration to see if the outcome would be different. Biden's EPA approved our motion to reconsider and spent 90 days reviewing our petition. In December of last year, the Biden EPA publicly said they granted our petition. However, when we read their official response, we realized they failed to approve the majority of our testing requests. Therefore, in January, we decided to sue the EPA for essentially denying our petition. Here's an infographic that shows what the EPA did not grant and why we feel our petition was wrongfully denied. As you can see, the EPA failed to require testing on 47 of the 54 PFAS, restricted testing for 7 PFAS on a tiered approach that could result in no animal studies for the critical endpoints that are important to us that we highlighted in the petition. They did not address the petition's request for rodent cancer studies on the 14 PFAS that we labeled as tier 1 PFAS. These means that there was strong evidence of exposure in drinking water and human blood for those tier 1 14 PFAS. The EPA did not require additional testing for Gen X compounds. The EPA refused to require a comprehensive epidemiological study of our residents. It rejected biomonitoring of Chemours employees. It declined to require testing on mixtures that we found in drinking water and in blood. And it refused to require Chemours to develop and submit analytical standards and methods for the 54 PFAS. It also failed to address the petition's request for ecotoxicity and fate and transport studies on all 54 PFAS. One of the most important testing requests we made within our petition was access to a large-scale human epidemiological study. The sheer geographical size of our contaminated region means we have access to hundreds of thousands of residents who could participate in an epidemiological study large enough to give us the statistical power many scientists say is needed to establish causal harm for our PFAS exposures. The EPA rejected this request, claiming sufficient data could be gained from PFAS epidemiological studies happening in other parts of the nation. Unfortunately, those studies are mainly Department of Defense contaminated sites, many of which are dealing with AFFF contamination, which is firefighting foam, and not industrial PFAS contamination. To my knowledge, I don't believe these studies have the statistical power to even establish causal harm for the endpoints that they're researching. Another important testing request in our petition are mixture studies. We were not exposed to one PFAS. We were overexposed to dozens of different PFAS, many unique to Chemours. Our PFAS exposures and mixtures have been well documented within our drinking water. For the past 12 months, CFPUA residents in Wilmington who get their water from the Sweeney Water Treatment Plant have consumed between 28 and 305 parts per trillion of total PFAS. The majority of those are unique to Chemours. Brunswick County residents have been consuming anywhere between 60 to 357 parts per trillion of total PFAS in their tap water regularly. Scientists believe PFAS may have additive or synergistic effects, which would not be revealed by testing individual PFAS separately. We were disappointed to see the EPA ignored our mixture testing requests, which appears to contradict its own guidance that recognizes whole mixture testing as optimal. The EPA also appears to be slow walking access to mixture testing and their own national PFAS testing strategy, which is separate from our petition request. It's important to note TOXTA gives the EPA authority to tandem test when there's evidence of human exposures and risks. So now what? Recently, our lawsuit was assigned to Federal District Court Chief Judge Richard Myers II here in Wilmington, North Carolina. Under Section 21 of TSCA, the court does not defer to the EPA's previous actions, but must make it fresh, i.e. de novo determination, based on the merits of the petition. So even though this is a highly technical case, our petition is strongly supported by leading scientists, and we are looking forward to seeing how the courts rule on this petition. And that is it for the overview on where we're at in our fight to gain comprehensive health studies. And so I'm happy to answer any questions if we have any.
Thank you, Emily. I'm going to ask the questions that have been placed in the chat. The first one is, there haven't really been studies of the links to cancer, but is there any known link between PFAS and cancer? It seems that there has been a strong uptick in cancer diagnoses in the Brunswick and New Hanover County area.
Yeah, so there have been 2 cancers linked to PFOA per the C8 Science Panel. I believe those were testicular and kidney cancer. Now, as far as cancer upticks, what is really interesting is that there's a latency period. And I know that Dr. Jamie DeWitt, she is an amazing toxicologist at Eastern Carolina University. And she has said many times publicly that cancer takes time to reveal itself in a population. So, your exposure could happen and then there could be, years before the cancer reveals itself. So I'm not surprised that we're seeing an uptick in cancer. It is incredibly concerning. I'm seeing it pretty regularly. And unfortunately, without these large scale human epidemiological studies, or without a study that specifically is looking at cancer, then it's really hard for us to say one way or another if these exposures were caused by our, or if these cancers were caused by our exposures. And so that's why these studies are really important.
Thank you. What is the EPA definition of long-term exposure?
Oh, that's a really good question. And I'm not sure I have an answer for it, but I can find out.
Okay. How effective are the new water scrubbing measures from Cape Fear Water and Brunswick Water Systems?
So each of them are doing something different. Cape Fear Public Utility Authority is installing deep bed GAC filters. And from what I understand, their initial tests are looking fairly good. Brunswick County is doing reverse osmosis. They are basically building a whole new plant right beside their existing treatment plant. And mainly that's because Brunswick County had probably the least sophisticated treatment system in the 3-county area. And so they needed to make these investments. So they're going for RO. So numerous studies have shown that RO tends to be the most effective at removing PFAS. However, CFPUA says that they feel really confident that they're going to be able to remove a good majority of the PFAS once their system is fully online.
Do you want to just make a distinction between the 2 different Brunswick County water systems and their approaches?
Yeah, so there's right now, and there currently in Brunswick County, there are 2 water treatment plants and a 3rd one that's being built independently. So Brunswick County owns the Northwest Treatment Plant, which is in the Leland area, and Brunswick County owns the 211 plant, which draws from the groundwater, which is near the Southport area. So historically, the water coming from the Oak Island Southport area has come from the 211 plant. However, as Brunswick County has grown and has to reach and has to manage capacity and demand issues, especially in the summer months when populations tend to double in our coastal communities, they blend the water with the Northwest treatment plant. And that Northwest treatment plant gets their primary source from the Cape Fear River, which is heavily polluted with PFAS. So it's the position of Brunswick County that the water is blended throughout the county. And so there's no guarantee that there's one area of the county that's not getting PFAS at any point in time. Now, in the Leland area, H2Go is a water district. They were a sanitary district that purchased wholesale water from Brunswick County, from the Northwest treatment plant, and provides it to its customers here in Leland. But H2Go, a few years ago, wanted to become its own water treatment plant and make water from a deep aquifer and provide it to the residents in this area. And so that construction was approved, and they are in the process of completing it. I think the latest information I heard from that from their construction is that it is on pause. There's, I think, 10 well pumps that are on back order due to supply chain issues related to the pandemic. And once they receive those, they can continue to move forward, and hope this area, or the Leland area, will begin to receive their own reverse osmosis water coming from a deep ground aquifer.
And I did hear that July is currently the most optimistic estimate on when we'll get that water. Thank you, Emily. Is there any evidence of increase in health disorders in the New Hanover County and Brunswick County area?
So there was evidence when the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services looked at initial cancer reports. They did see an uptick, I believe, in testicular cancers, and I want to say one other, but I can't remember if it's kidney or liver. As for other upticks, we have seen thyroid cancer. There was a big glaring, if you went on to the cancer cluster data reporting for North Carolina and you clicked thyroid cancer, 5 years ago, this region, Brunswick, Pender, New Hanover County, looked like it was a very severe cancer cluster for thyroid cancer. So that is currently being researched to confirm what is causing the thyroid cancer clusters in our area. As far as other cancers, there hasn't really been any conclusive evidence, but I know that there has been most recently, Jamie DeWitt had reported in a recent news article that there's some compelling information on breast cancer, bladder cancer, and I believe one other cancer. But again, studies, or the scientific community works under consensus. So it's being able to have either a large scale study that has the statistical power to give confidence, or a whole bunch of smaller studies that can build some sort of consensus. And so that's where we're at.
I'm going to suggest that you stop sharing so that we can see big Emily instead of little Emily. Okay, has consideration been given to require Chemours to assume the costs of the carbon filtration RO plants?
So no, sadly, there's been, we've been stuck in court battle, not we, but our utilities have been stuck in discovery and court battles trying to get Chemours to pay for their fair share of these upgrades. And Chemours is apparently fighting back and spending a lot of money. If you turn on the news, you'll see a commercial that talks about Chemours being a good neighbor, because apparently they would rather spend their money reminding us that they're a good neighbor versus actually being a good neighbor and paying for utility upgrades, or even paying for immediate water protection. I think that's probably one of the biggest frustrations that I've experienced in this fight, is that Chemours has agreed to provide immediate protection to a private well if a private well tests positive for their PFAS. However, we have 500,000 residents in Brunswick, Pender, and New Hanover County who are having to self-pay for their own water protections right now. And that, I think, is very harmful, and it causes a tremendous distinction between income inequality, and that's just unacceptable in my mind and inhumane.
Thank you. Let's see. Your slide on large-scale epidemiological studies concluded that the EPA is on weak footing. Can you say more about that?
I think that I would probably defer, unfortunately, to legal counsel to explain what that would require. I don't feel confident enough to address why they're there, or why we feel that the EPA is on weak footing. But if I am going to make a personal guess, and I'm speaking on behalf of myself and not the co-petitioners or legal counsel, just from what I've noticed is that we have heard EPA tell us that they have full legal authority to grant our petition. So what we're hearing is, if the holdup is not that we don't have the legal right, the holdup is that they've never done it before. And in my mind, that just doesn't sound like a really strong reason to deny access to this really important information.
Is there an avenue? Oh, sorry, wait, I skipped one. How can the average family in the affected area obtain clean water in their household, especially if under the sink RO or delivered water options are not financially viable?
Yeah, that one is heartbreaking and sad. It is really unfair because, and I've been trying for 5 years now to figure out a way to convince anyone who will listen to level the playing field and let families, especially those who can't afford these expensive filtration systems or water delivery services, access to toxic-free drinking water. So a couple of things that could be done. Our state lawmakers could write a law any day that would require Chemours to provide this type of immediate water protection to all 500,000 downstream residents. It just requires the political will to do it. DEQ could also require it, and DEQ would require a little more political will on their end as well to do it. The consent agreement that was established in 2019 provides water protection for private well owners. It does not provide it for those of us that rely on the Cape Fear River. And again, the distinction is the source of the water, and that feels incredibly unfair, but it's also kind of related in statutes and the way the laws are written in our state. So heavily pressuring our state legislature to make these changes, heavily pressuring our local leaders to demand that our state leaders act on our behalf is also another really good way to get what we need. I know that that's not a satisfying answer because it doesn't help us today. It doesn't help us tomorrow. That's more of a long-term strategy. So unfortunately, I don't know of pockets of money that can help us. I pressured the school boards in New Hanover County and Brunswick County to install all our RO filling stations. So another way to do it is to just try mutual aid techniques in your community to see if you can get filters or vouchers for filters to those who need them.
Thank you.
Or seek them for yourself.
I think it's an appropriate time to also mention that tomorrow is the last day we can vote in the primary, and it's important to vote for those elected officials who will forcefully advocate for PFAS remedies in North Carolina. So make sure you think about that and make sure you vote. Is there an avenue for approaching our local medical community to get them more interested in obtaining the information they need to help us be proactive and preventive on these possible health issues?
That is a fantastic question. And we have tried to reach out to the medical community, and then of course COVID hit, and that was a very sensitive time and very hard to try and ask them to focus on PFAS when they're stretched thin and in the middle of their own immediate public health crisis. So we look at PFAS as a long-term health crisis. COVID is a very short-term and very, very important and severe health crisis in its own right. So we've kind of taken a back seat. Some things that we did do, or that I would like to point out, is the National Academies of Science is looking at reviewing clinical guidance for PFAS. So they're doing a really big literature review of all of the health data that currently exists. And then they're going to create clinical guidance that should be released sometime late this summer or fall. And this is the type of information that the medical community kind of relies on. So when a doctor learns that a patient has been exposed to something, then they can kind of go back and look at clinical reviews or clinical guidance from the National Academies of Science and see what is the recommended course of action. Now, this isn't binding or regulatory, but it is kind of the process in which things work. And I worked with Dr. Kyle Horton and her organization. She started a new nonprofit called On Your Side. And we worked together to try and gather physician signatures in support of making sure that that guidance was strong enough to really cover the concerns and needs of communities like ours. And then I was a community liaison community liaison for the committee as they're reviewing the documents. And so we definitely advocated strongly to make sure that information will be accessible and relevant. However, I do feel that more could be done with our local physicians community, and I absolutely welcome any synergy there.
I heard that there are new EPA standards coming out shortly for PFAS. Could you speak to that?
Yes. So he's not Secretary Regan. Administrator Regan used to be Secretary Regan for Department of Environmental Quality here in North Carolina. And now he's overseeing the EPA. And one thing that he did when he came into office was issue a PFAS roadmap. And in that roadmap, there were some very ambitious timelines, which we're grateful for. One of those timelines was issuing drinking water health advisories for Gen X by late spring. And then I believe reassessing PFOA and PFOS and a couple of other legacy compounds this year as well. And establishing drinking water standards, which would be really important because we do not currently have a single drinking water standard for any of the PFAS that we are aware of. What I'm hearing is that we should be expecting in a couple of weeks or any day now to receive the health advisory for Gen X, and it'll be very interesting to see what the EPA ends up establishing. Just to remember, a health advisory limit, I referred to one earlier, there's the current one is for PFOA and PFOS, and that's 70 parts per trillion. So it'll be interesting to see what is released for Gen X. North Carolina has a health goal established of 140 parts per trillion right now for Gen X. But based on the toxicological assessment that the EPA released last October, that is likely too high and needs to be lowered. So we're expecting a lowered level for Gen X.
Funds from the sale of New Hanover County Medical Center were to be used in part for the health of the community. Is this possibly a source of funding for you?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic source of funding. Now, because we're not a nonprofit, we don't accept money. But what we have encouraged and do continue to encourage city council leaders and county leaders to consider is looking into funding their own studies or even investing in a cancer research institute for our region. So if we know we have these exposures, and while we're pushing to learn what those exposures mean, I think it would be really fantastic if we took what was really a negative and turned it into a positive and established ourselves as a premier cancer research center in the Wilmington area so that we could provide high quality care to an overexposed community. So that's one thing that we've been advocating for when we have meetings with elected officials.
So from a personal standpoint, I have an RO filter in my home. I use it for my drinking water. I use it for cooking. I use it to make ice cubes. But when I'm out at restaurants, I always find myself buying bottled water if they even have it. And it would be helpful, and I'm willing to help with this. I'm not dumping this on you, for someone to maintain a list of here are the restaurants that have RO filtered water, and are serving that to their customers.
I think it's
there was no question there, but is that something that Clean Cape Fear would think about compiling or offering or something like that?
Absolutely. So, it's always the legwork. So if there's a couple of helper bees that can verify that the data is accurate, we're happy to make sure that it's amplified and posted on our website and shared on our social media platforms. One of the things that we tried to do early on in 2017, that was part of one of our strategy when we formed, was to work with the business community to create kind of like a sticker or decal that they could put on their windows that said that they were, like a clean water, clean water provided here or whatever. I couldn't remember what term we came up with. Where we ran into complications was, where do you draw the line? What is considered? How do you qualify? And it became kind of very cumbersome to figure out what was a good distinction or not. Also at that time, we didn't have access to some of the filtration information that we do now. So now there's a lot more clarity on what we would feel confident to say, yes, that they're doing a good business practice. But on a smaller scale, just to simply have a running list of places where the business owners claim to offer, filtered water and what type of filtered water they're willing to disclose that they offer. Absolutely. I think it's a great idea.
Do the filtration cartridges that are part of undersink RO systems become hazardous waste when they are changed out? Is there a designated process for dealing with them?
Great question. No, there's no designated process right now. And because PFAS are not regulated, they're not listed as hazardous substances. So do I personally think that they are hazardous substances? Yes, these are forever chemicals with no proven safe disposal method. So when you put them in your trash, you're putting them into a landfill, which means they could potentially leach into the surrounding environment. Wherever they end up. So I think that is a huge problem. It is definitely being considered and addressed. It's not only a problem for the point of use, these under sink filters, it's also a problem at point of source down for wastewater treatment plants, which are, capturing a lot of waste themselves and having to decide how to dispose of it. It's also an issue for CFPUA and Brunswick County, as they are cleaning the water and making the water safe on large scales. What are they doing with the PFAS that they're capturing? There is no legal requirement right now whatsoever, none at the federal level, none at the state level. But some states are moving forward and have been creating standards. And so it'll be interesting to see how this movement plays out across other states. North Carolina has been very slow and very, in my mind, embarrassing about their level of action related to any sort of PFAS legislation in Raleigh.
Did you see the recent Consumer Reports article about PFAS in packaging of things like the paper that's used to wrap our hamburgers or the containers at Whole Foods, and the fact that, if something is heated and put in there, it is even more likely to release that stuff into the food that we're consuming. And at the very least, the packaging is going into the environment.
Yes, I know food packaging has been a very big concern, and there's been a lot of movement. There's been a lot of movement at state legislatures to remove PFAS from food packaging. And in fact, I do believe the Biden administration is looking at an executive order action to eliminate PFAS in food packaging. I'd have to go back and research where things are at there. But there's a lot of different mechanisms to try and get PFAS out of food packaging. We've participated in a whole bunch of campaigns that pressure industry and corporations like Whole Foods to remove them from their shelves and refuse to purchase them. So there's a lot of different strategies in play, but the best strategy is honestly to stop it at the source. They really don't belong there to begin with.
I even heard paper plates. This is not really related, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you know what causes the black debris in our faucet aerators?
I don't, but I know what you're talking about. And it's, it's not PFAS, because PFAS is colorless, odorless, and sightless. So you wouldn't know, we don't know what PFAS looks like. What I'm heard, but again, this is not verified information, is, it could be sediment from pipes. It could be a number of things. But I know to see it in your filter or anywhere near your faucet is kind of alarming. So sorry, wish I had a better answer.
Emily, if I can interrupt for a moment, if I can talk, we had Cape Fear Public Utility out here at length in this new division at River Lights, the Dale Webb River Lights, because of the buildup of the black sludge around around your faucets, and also, in the bathtubs and so on. They said it is a type of algae that grows when chlorine is exposed to air. And it is not supposedly dangerous. We did take samples in to have it tested with an independent lab, but they are still not certain. And at this point in time, we are seeing a rapid buildup again. For a while, when they came out and flushed the various pipes and so on, it was better. But I think there's some concern now because of where water is beginning to be brought in 26 miles above us from the Cape Fear River and piped in. There seems like there may be some more problems. So that's not a very complete answer, but it's what Cape Fear Public Utilities gave us.
Yeah, and I think it's amazing that you are independently testing. We just, unfortunately, we're at that place right now where public trust needs to be rebuilt. And sometimes the way to do that is test and verify, just to make sure everybody's on the same page. So I'm really grateful that you did that. And hopefully we learned. One thing I have learned throughout this whole process, because by the way, I never thought I would know this much about tap water, is just that it is complex, and I took it for granted where we just how we get drinking water, and it makes me that much more sensitive to the fact that we really do need to do a better job of protecting our sources. There was a really interesting book I read. It's a small tangent, but Troubled Waters is a book by I think Seth Siegel, I think is the author's name. But he documents kind of the history of tap water and where we've gotten today. And really, it starts with disinfection. The moment we learned how to disinfect, so we used to protect our drinking water source because we knew it could make us really sick quick if we didn't. And so there, some communities would always find their drinking water source and make sure to really guard and not put anything around it. And then we discovered disinfectants. And when we discovered disinfectants, everybody thought that was the cure. And so people became less protective of drinking water sources and more reliant on disinfectants. And I think that this has kind of now been a catch-22 and a bit of a chicken and egg issue, where we are stuck with the fact that we have now overdeveloped and we have lost sight of protecting our sources and become over-reliant on a chemistry that itself can cause problems or could potentially cause problems. And so there's always this kind of running around in circles. So it's a fascinating book, and I highly recommend reading it because it also gives you an overview of just how broken our entire Safe Drinking Water Act system is, and how we just assume that because we live in the United States of America, an incredibly rich nation, that we should have high quality water. And that's just not true. So eye-opening, good, depressing summer read. Well, just, it's a good read. I don't know if you want it to be your summer read, but.
How can the League of Women Voters of the Lower Cape Fear members and our associated friends support these efforts?
Yeah, so we are definitely working on building a mechanism. And when I'm talking about myself and co-petitioners to keep the community aware, engaged, and whenever we can provide actionable items, we definitely will. So I know that's very vague and not super wonderful to hear right now, but we're just in the process of figuring out what that looks like. So please just stay tuned, and I will make sure to amplify. Another thing that you can do is definitely make sure our primary way of communicating important comments or conversations is Twitter and Facebook. So definitely follow us, Clean Cape Fear, on Twitter and Facebook if you have that. And then also,
you want to pop that in the chat for us, Emily, when you get a chance?
I sure can. And then if you want to sign up for or subscribe to our Action Network whenever we have really big alerts where we're seeking signatures for petitions, it's important to sign up for those so that you can get that information fast.
Fridge filters say they reduce PFAS, but how do we know how much reduction there actually is? Is the water really drinkable from the fridge?
I mean, this is an interesting question. And if we're looking for 100% guarantee, I just don't know that we can offer that. And I mean, anyone can, and here's why. Because your filter manufacturer can say that they test for PFAS, but because there's 6,000 to 9,000 of them, and many of them don't have analytical standards, we know that if there's any testing happening on PFAS, the testing is on select numbers of PFAS. And in our region, on top, we were exposed to Chemours PFAS as well, which don't always have analytical standards available to commercial labs. So I think it's really important when we talk about this topic of, truth in advertising, especially on filtration and in harmed communities, that we take a step back and we really assess and ask the manufacturer, when you claim that you can remove PFAS, which analytes are you talking about, which compounds? Now, both Brunswick County and CFPUA provide their own testing of the tap water, and they show you exactly what's in it. So you can go and look at those sample results and see which compounds that they're testing for. And you can share that information with the filter manufacturer and say, this is what is in my water, or this is part of what's in my water. We also know that there's probably at least 200 to 300 other different PFAS in our water coming from Chemours, but we don't have access to the analytical standards to test for them right now. So we don't know. And what I mean by that is, when CFPUA was testing and Brunswick County was testing our tap water 3 years ago, they were testing for like 25, 26 PFAS, and now they're testing for over 50. So again, as the analytical standards become available, they add them to the test list. And so that's what we keep seeing. So that's an important part of the conversation. So what do I do? Because I think that we could again run around in circles with this, trying to figure out how can I guarantee that what's coming out of my fridge is the safest. One thing I would remember is to look at the filtration technology. And I feel like NC State has a PFAS Superfund Center, and they have a community hub. And if I get a second, I'll try and pop that in the chat. But they have a really good PDF, leave behind, that explains the difference between granulated activated carbon filtration and RO filtration. And they did their own tests, and they tested the water in our region, and they were able to kind of show which filters seem to be the most effective. And it looks like someone, thank you very much, put in the chat on our website, we actually post some NC State studies that were done specifically for the tap water in our region. So you can look at those as well. But really, at this point in the game, what I try to remind myself is that RO seems to be the most effective technology. So if you're someone who is concerned about your exposures, then focus in on trying to access RO filtration, either through under sink, installation of an under sink filter, which I know is incredibly costly. And if that is unachievable, then you can purchase, which is less ideal for the environment, you can purchase bottled water, as long as the packaging says that it's purified with reverse osmosis technology. And then there's even filling stations. If you want to try and reduce some of your plastic consumption, you can get the 5-gallon jugs and a dispenser, and you can fill it up at filling stations at grocery stores. I know Walmart has them, and so do most major grocery stores. But sorry, the question was really about the fridge. I don't think the fridge alone can really protect us. And so I would use, I think there is a study on my website that shows that you could that someone in the Wilmington area took the fridge manufacturers or the filter in their refrigerator that's connected to their ice maker. And then they also attached a filter on the back of their water line that leads to their refrigerator. And Dr. Canape's lab at NC State tested that. And it did show that it was effective at removing the PFAS. It didn't remove it all. It wasn't a 100% complete removal, but it was significant. And so that study is listed on our website under filters, and so you can go and review that too.
Yeah, and if you have the option, which many of you don't, if you have the RO filter under your sink, if your kitchen is configured properly, or not even properly, but conveniently, you can run the line from your RO filter to your refrigerator. And that way, whatever's coming out of your refrigerator is RO filtered. We don't have that option in our kitchen, but it is an option.
So it is,
So, yeah, I'm sorry, Clarice, go ahead.
I was going to say it's 5 minutes to 12.
Yes.
So we're wrapping this up. Is there one more question or is it time to finish?
Nope, no more questions.
Well, thank you then, Emily, very much. We appreciate your time. And I can't either believe that you know so much about our tap water. Thank you for that knowledge and sharing it. We all appreciate it greatly. Thanks to Joanne and Leslie for doing tech things during this presentation. As you can see, there are links to the website, to essentials and social media in the chat, I believe. Is that true, Joanne?
I will be putting them in there.
Okay. And I would like to draw your attention to a very important meeting that we will be having. The annual meeting is on June the 4th at 10 o'clock in the morning. You can go to this at the Arboretum. We're actually going to have an in-person meeting in a room, our first ever, I think, for how many years now. The brunch will be available for $10, no, $20. But you can, if you don't want to come to the brunch, you can just, the meeting will come at 11 o'clock. We need lots of you there, folks, because we need a quorum. If we don't have a quorum, we don't have a board for next year. So please do sign up. Joanne is going to put that information, it is on the website. Do sign up. Hope that I'll see lots of you there or on the Zoom screen. Let's see. I think that does it for our announcements. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate your learning about this and hope we see you again soon.